Thanks very much, Malcolm, and Scott has already said quite a bit about my work, and so I'm not going to go over that same territory, you'll be pleased to know. At the last election, the 2010 election, you'll remember immigration was very much on the agenda, and it's generally it's not on the agenda at elections, but at the last election it was. And yeah, certainly in my view, the debate was not a very well-informed debate, and in many ways it was not a very seemly debate. And as a result of that, prior to that, the Rudd government had set up an inquiry into population in Australia. I think the purpose of Rudd's inquiry was to take population off the agenda in time for the election. But the report was released by the government in 2011, and it's called Sustainable Australia, Sustainable Communities and a Sustainable Population Strategy for Australia. So it's incredibly sustainable. It's a glossy report with lots of photos, and it doesn't say very much in maybe 100 pages or so. But it does say a couple of important things, and one of them is the following statement. It is more useful for governments, businesses and communities to focus on ways of improving our well-being, protecting our environment and making better use of the resources we have, rather than trying to determine an absolute limit to our population and focusing efforts on restricting growth in order to not exceed that limit. So in other words, it's saying there were demands for some kind of limit to Australia's population, that Australia's population should stop growing now, and there's a political party that believes that now. The Stable Population Party believes that Australia's population growth should be stopped exactly where it is now. This statement says no, that's not the way to go, and as far as I'm aware, there is no country in the world that has such a policy. So there's a question about what is a population policy, and no country in the world has a population policy that says we want the population to be X, and indeed no country in the world has a population policy that says we want the rate of growth of the population to be X, even 0. And that's because I think there's, those with experience in this area know that you just can't control population to that kind of level. That there are factors that come along all the time, and so population is going to be influenced by those factors. Coming to the migration program, the government's report in 2011 also said Australia's migration program is now firmly founded on the skills Australia needs to support its economy. And another strong statement with which I agree. And it's really the story of Australian history. If you look back through Australian history, you'll see migration going up and down, and you have a look at what that's associated with, and it's associated with fluctuations in the economy. No government in Australian history, when there was a downturn in the economy, said, okay, we're going to increase migration. They always do exactly the opposite. As soon as there is a downturn, governments move immediately to reduce migration. That's the permanent migration program. During the when the global financial crisis hit, the 457 movement, for example, the temporary long-stay business visa to Australia, which was designed to be a responsive approach to labour demand in Australia, it dropped immediately. So employers stopped making applications at that time because of that. They were worried about the GFC and where they might be heading. Very, very responsive. So it is indeed the case that migration to Australia is heavily influenced by labour demand relative to labour supply and skills in Australia, and that's, in my view, as it should be. The migration program to Australia, and Scott's outlined it to some extent with his reference to temporary migration, but even the skilled side of it has changed quite dramatically over the last 10 to 15 years. So in the last year, the last financial year, about 60% of the permanent skilled migration intake consisted of people who applied onshore. They were already in Australia, almost 60%. That's very different to our image of migration again. This is the permanent migrant, the permanent skilled part. Now our image is the person, the 10-pound bomb and so on, the people who come from overseas, and these days, if you're going to apply from overseas, from India, say, and you're a skilled person, then you wait in line for a long time. You're going to get through the process much faster if you're here in Australia and you get a job here. Maybe you come on a 457 visa, temporary visa, you get a job in Australia, the employer likes you and the employer sponsors you for permanent migration. You like Australia. So it's a system that is a very good system, I think, that we've moved in that direction. That rather than kind of the lottery of picking a person from India that nobody's ever met, we don't really know what their skills are. We've shifted to a system where the vast majority now are recruited onshore. They're not just 457 people, they're also overseas students, and sometimes even working holiday makers. So working holiday makers come here and they happen to be quite skilled, as many of them are, and they get linked up with an employer, and then the employer decides to sponsor them to remain in Australia. The temporary component now, and here I add up all the categories, long stay business visa, okay, 1%. But if a long stay business visa, the overseas students, international students, a very high proportion of them are working in Australia. They are permitted to work 20 hours a week. The apocryphal story of the taxi driver that I spoke with, he was a very clever guy because he told me how students were recruited. He was from Pakistan, how students were recruited in Pakistan, and they had the whole system. It was very interesting. But he said, well, I asked him, well, why do students want to come to Australia rather than go to the US or to the UK? And he said, oh, well, in the US and the UK, they restrict students to 20 hours a week work. And of course, we do too. But, and so students are very heavily involved in the labour force, obviously working holiday makers. And another category that we haven't mentioned who are very important in Australian migration is New Zealanders. There are now some 600,000 New Zealand citizens in Australia, a fabulously large number. And these categories now, if you add them all up, including New Zealanders, constitute maybe 8 or 9% of the Australian labour force, which is, these are temporary residents of Australia. The New Zealanders are allowed to stay here, but I kind of classify them in the temporary category because we make it very difficult for New Zealanders to become Australian citizens. And I think that's a major political issue that needs to be addressed sometime in the future. To become an Australian citizen, a New Zealander has to become a permanent resident the same way as everybody else becomes a permanent resident. That means they have to be young, they have to be skilled. And many of them are not young and skilled. They've already passed that point. And so we have this large group of people in Australia who have no access to citizenship in Australia. And I understand that the New Zealand Prime Minister is interested in this issue as well, so that it is a serious issue, I think. And of course, they don't have citizenship and their children don't have citizenship, so it is a serious issue. That's why I mention that, because I classify them under the temporary category. 8% of the 8 to 9% of the total employed persons in Australia. The other interesting thing is that we do run a highly skilled migration program through the permanent program, and the 457s are generally highly skilled. But the overseas students, the international students, although highly skilled, don't work in skilled jobs. The majority of them work in relatively lower level jobs. Same with working holiday makers. Working holiday makers are usually pretty highly skilled, but they don't work in highly skilled jobs. So we've got some quite good people working in lower level jobs, often on a part-time basis, but And the New Zealanders, my best guess, and I need to do some work on this actually, is that they're spread right across the distribution of occupations. We've got highly skilled people and we've got lowly skilled people. So this kind of funneling system that we've developed, people come here on a temporary basis, get together with an employer, and then maybe become permanent, or they don't get together with an employer and they leave. It's a very efficient system, in my view. Employers get to see that they like the worker and the worker likes them, etc. It's also, as I mentioned before, flexible and responsive, so that a temporary, certainly the 457 is that way. Dropped away with the 2008 financial crisis. It's been rising since then, and there are some people who suggest that applications for 457s is a good indicator of the future direction of the economy. That is, that employers are looking at where the economy is heading, and they'll apply for 457s for some time in the future. And for your information, the numbers have been relatively flat for about the last year. So it's not looking like it's on the way up. Another interesting thing about about temporary migrants, and skilled migrants for that matter as well, and where do they live and where do they impact in the city. They live, particularly the temporary ones, in the inner part of the big cities. So they're living here in this electorate. They're very highly concentrated, both skilled migrants in the permanent stream and a lot of the temporary migrants prefer to live in the inner city of the inner part of the big cities, particularly Sydney and Melbourne. Another interesting story on the skilled migration program, I think, is the story of this state back in the past somewhat, where the Premier of New South Wales, the one who is now the Foreign Minister, determined that migration was not a good thing for Sydney, and that we would essentially put a ban on migration coming into Sydney, as far as you could do that. And the net result of that was that Sydney was suffering a skills loss. There were people leaving Sydney to go to Queensland. There were people leaving Sydney, all our young, brilliant people leaving Sydney to go work in New York and London. But the skilled people were not coming into Sydney because the channel through the skilled migration program had been reduced so much. So it was I think Sydney and New South Wales went through some bad times, and you can't blame that all on migration, of course. But I think it was a factor in the story for New South Wales, that it was actually experiencing a skills loss during that period, because as the numbers coming through in the young ages, of course, are relatively small as well. I've also argued that the immigration has played an important role in the management of the Australian economy during the current mining boom. Without migration, the size of the Australian labour force would be falling now. That's probably not kind of generally recognised, but the size of the Australian labour force, it would be falling, not rising. And that's going to get worse over the next decade as the baby boom generation retires, if there was no migration. Migration is the only potential source of any future growth in the labour force. Well, you can increase